Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban. Welcome to episode 244 of the podcast. It's March 9th, 2016. My guest today is Dan Markovitz. This is part two of a discussion that we started back in episode 241 about his book, Building the Fit Organization, 6 Core Principles for Making Your Company Stronger, Faster, and More Competitive. In part one, back in episode 241, we talked about the first 3 themes of his book, which are 1, commit to improvement, 2, increase value, don't cut costs, and 3, think horizontally. And today we're going to talk about the last 3. So I hope you enjoy the discussion. To learn more about Dan and his book, go to leanblog.org/244. Okay, so we're back here with part 2, having a really good conversation with Dan Markovitz about his book, most recent book, Building the Fit Organization. Dan, thanks for coming back to continue our chat.
I couldn't be happier. I love doing this with you, Mark.
Yeah, and we had such a good conversation. It was running long, and we covered, among other topics, the first 3 sort of key principles from your book, Dan. Why don't we just kind of jump into the 4th principle and standard work? How do you treat that in the book? What are the connections between the idea of fitness and lean and organizations?
Well, if we think about standard work from a fitness metaphor, it really jibes with what a lot of people know. If you're, for example, going to be powerlifting, you're going to want to hold the bar in a certain way. You're going to want to lift it in a certain way so that you don't blow out your back or destroy your knees. If you're swimming, there's standard work. There's a certain way to hold your hands, to hold your head. There are certain positions that you can swim faster and smoother. Running, same thing. There are certain basic primary techniques for running, but how you hold your arms and how you hold your chin and what you do with your knees and so on. So I think that with fitness, we're used to standards. I mean, heck, you go into a gym if you have a physical trainer and the trainer says, this is how you do the exercise. So standard work is something we accept in that environment. I think in a corporate environment, certainly standard work has its roots in a lot of respects in the training within industry movement during World War II. So here's how you hold a hammer, here's how you work a drill press, here's how you do these things so that the product comes out properly and you don't hurt yourself. But I think there's also standardized work for leaders. What are you going to do on each day? When are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? How are you going to talk to people? What are you going to look for? When are you going? How often are you going to do these things?
Yeah.
And I was really struck by something that James Hereford, who is the COO of Stanford Medical Center, said to me. He lives by standard work, and as do all of his direct reports. And he said, the benefit for me for standardized work is that it keeps me from drowning in administrivia. And I love that, because what he's saying is these things are really important, and in my position there's a really high risk that I'm not going to get to do these things, whatever those things are on his list of standard work, because of the 1,000,001 fires that are going to break out, the emergency meetings, the sudden phone calls and emails. This ensures that I don't lose sight of the important things, and I don't forget how to do my job properly. Yeah. And I think that's a real, from both the front line of here's how you enter a customer order to the COO of a hospital saying, this is how I run my week. I think that there's standard work that's relevant at all levels and to all people.
Yeah. Well, I think, one thing that's interesting about James and his own standardized work is that, as a COO, he's got the autonomy to say, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to create my own standard work. It's helping me. He's got that ability to do that. And I think, it's interesting when you look at whether it's assembly line workers or employees in a hospital, standardized work has generally been dictated by management, dictated by engineers. This is basically the Frederick Taylor approach of I'm the expert, you're the worker, I'm going to show you how to do it. Right. James has the ability, he's choosing to follow standardized work. The thing I think is different about Lean and interesting about Lean, even if you go back to Toyota people have always written and said very clearly, standardized work is developed by the people who do the work. And that's a key distinction.
Yes. There's a photo in my book of the standardized work that the customer service department at NFI and Industries has put together. NFI is a third-party logistics company, and their wall is filled with these, not binders, but little, I forgot what you call these things. They're sort of clear plastic buckets that you attach to a wall.
Kind of document holders.
Yeah. So the standard work is not in a 3-ring binder collecting dust in a shelf. It's right on the wall. The standard work is laminated. And the front of it, so the customer service reps are the ones who make the standard work. And it's fascinating. They put in big letters, not just how to enter a return or how to change a ship date or something like that, but the customer service reps have actually used their own language. So it says things like zoinks. The customer says that he can't be there to pick up the shipment, or oh darn, the shipping agent is out today. What do I do? Or holy moly, this is whatever it is. And so they're having fun with it. It's their language written by them, and they don't laminate the standard work until everyone agrees that this is the way to do it. And it's fascinating when they don't follow standard work. The first thing they do is they go to the person who didn't follow the standard work and say, walk us through what you did. Help us understand why you didn't follow standard work, because maybe we need to change it.
Yeah.
As opposed to, what's the matter with you? You didn't follow standard work.
Right.
The assumption is that the standard work is wrong if someone didn't follow it.
Or there was, I would add, there's something in the system that prevented you from following the standardized work. Something that prompted a workaround or prompted some scenario, or sometimes you learn that, the way we wrote the standardized work document was maybe a little bit too specific, and part of our standard work is, there's a time and a place for judgment. And I think as you get away from the assembly line and highly repetitive, highly engineered work, I think that's the reality in jobs, is that there's, I think, certain key in any work, there's certain key specific things that do have to be done a very particular way for some reason. And you mentioned training within industry. I think the brilliant thing about TWI is that even 70 years ago, that approach never just said do this, do that. It was more a matter of also explaining why those steps are important, and helping people internalize it so they can choose to follow the standardized work instead of being coerced into following it. I think, to me, that's what makes it lean compared to, quote unquote, Taylorism.
One thing people often forget about the TWI is that the way TWI was taught was also standardized.
Yeah.
It wasn't just, this is how you're going to do the task, but this is how you're going to teach people to do this task.
Yeah. Well, the standardized work for the trainer, sort of like you were suggesting, standardized work for a leader.
Exactly. And then in the hospital world, of course, you run into resistance and misunderstanding of this all the time. You've blogged about it in particular recently, in fact, quite extensively.
Well, yeah, and it was a lot of this was I've blogged about it before, and the complaints I've heard a lot of times come from a place of anxiety. People hear about lean. It's the word doesn't help us, but they start thinking, their minds start going to a place where they say, oh, this is going to be, people are going to tell me how to practice medicine. They're telling me how to do my work. These standards are going to be inappropriate or inflexible, or and I said, well, wait a minute. They don't have to be inappropriate and inflexible, because we'll work together to make sure they are appropriate and flexible, and that we're improving them over time because we're engaging people instead of it being dictated. But the New England Journal of Medicine published an opinion piece by a couple of doctors from Boston where they were decrying what the headline called medical Taylorism. And ironically, the things they were complaining about related to Taylorism were the same things that I complained about with the old General Motors culture of the old GM culture when I worked there 20 years ago, of managers focusing on quantity before quality, not letting people stop the line, not listening to people. And if these doctors feel like that's the environment they're in, I would stand shoulder to shoulder and say what you're describing is a problem. But I would say lean is the alternative, where they've somehow confounded that, well, what's happening to us is lean. And there could be all sorts of reasons we'd speculate why they think these things are lean. But, I think it's all more complicated. I think, part of your original question back to me was, people being quote unquote resistant. And, I think in most resistance, there's some reasonable reason why: lack of understanding, lack of engagement, lack of alignment. I think the role of leaders to work through that resistance instead of just getting combative and blaming the doctors or whoever's being resistant.
I think there's also, you're absolutely right, and I think to go further, there should be an understanding that, and you've written about this, of course, that standardized work is not one size fits all.
No.
And that there is adaptation and accommodation for individuals and for the environment that are made, that should be made. And when we were talking the other day, I was thinking about this. I used to be a coach of a high school cross country team, and there are some basic standard principles that we follow. You don't start doing speed work until you've built a distance base, things like this.
Yeah.
But a distance base for you might involve running, and this is certainly true for me. I was not very good with high mileage because when I was a competitive runner, because my body didn't handle it very well for any one of 100 different reasons. And so my high mileage weeks were probably 50-mile weeks. I had teammates that were doing 110-mile weeks because that's what worked for them. The basic principle of getting the base mileage in before we would start doing the sharpening work, that held regardless. So first we did our base work, and then everyone did speed work. But what the base was and what the type of speed work was that we did varied very much depending on the individual. But the standard process of preparing to peak through the course of a season, that was consistent. Because you have to make accommodation for the individual biomechanics, for the individual strengths and weaknesses and abilities and capabilities.
Yeah. Well, and I think there, back to the fitness and sports realm, there's, I think, an interesting difference between individual sports and team sports. I used to play tennis in high school. So, if you look at being taught to hold the racket a certain way, even if you look among pro tennis players, which I was far from a pro tennis player, but there are so many different variations and different ways of holding the racket. And you think, well, that would be a very basic thing that I'm sure all of the best players have a best practice for how they hold the racket. But I think a lot of players would say, well, you know what, this works for me. My body mechanics and whatever, and what ultimately it comes down to is like, okay, if you're winning matches, who's going to argue with the way you serve the ball? But in team sports, I'm a huge fan of the San Antonio Spurs. There is such a system there, and there's at some point a bit of a maybe subjugation to the team goals as opposed to your individual goals, but. Yeah, I think workplaces are more of a team sport, unless, I'm kind of going back and forth here. On the other hand, a surgeon in the operating room, if I'm the patient, do I care that surgeon X is doing things exactly the same way as surgeon Y? Maybe not. Do they have the same outcomes? I think is the fair question. I saw an article the other day about a hospital where the hospital CEO, who was not a physician, was talking about their new facility that they had used lean design practices for, and a lot of it sounded really encouraging. And then he used an example like, well, in our hospital now, if any surgeon is doing an appendectomy, they're all going to be done exactly the same way. And I kind of thought, well, I wonder how the surgeons feel about that.
Right.
And what do you mean by exactly the same way? What if a surgeon's left-handed? Therefore, they're no longer doing it exactly the same way.
Or what if a patient is particularly obese or has a particularly challenging anatomy? Because every patient is different. I think that's where that gross hammer from above that says you will do it the same way runs into the very natural resistance and pushback from surgeons saying, well, wait a minute, I'm a lefty. You can't make me do it the same way. But maybe you use the same tools. Maybe you use the same basic approach to the appendectomy. Maybe you use the same sutures, so that that if you can standardize this, you can start to identify, well, we have more complications with these sutures than with those sutures, or we have more complications with this type of doing an appendectomy this way than that way. But if everyone's doing it their own way, then you don't really know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you talk about standardizing sutures or standardizing the type of knee implant. The only times I've ever heard about successful attempts at standardizing around medical devices or supplies or whatever, it was when it was surgeon driven, when it was a team of surgeons.
Right.
Or the chief working with the surgeons to figure out. I think the key questions are, what needs to be standardized, to what level of detail, and for what benefit. And, I think that when you have the discussion that way and you're engaging people, you may have a business goal. The CFO may come to the surgeons and say, look, hey, I bet we would really benefit by standardizing some of these devices. But I think, you can't just force that on the surgeons. You might be able to in the short term, but I don't think that's the right long-term strategy. You've got to engage them and let them figure it out.
And this, of course, comes back to where we started, which you pointed out, which is that the standard work needs to be created by the operator, whether that's a neurosurgeon or a carpenter or a janitor. It doesn't matter. The person doing the work knows what needs to be done and how it can be done most easily. And it's disrespectful, I think, for anyone. To your point, it's totally fine for the CFO or CEO to say, listen, we could really reduce our inventory carrying costs and drop $500,000 to the bottom line if we could reduce the number of artificial knees we have from 7 models to 3. Can you guys figure out a way to reduce it? And now you figure it out.
Sure.
Because you're the ones who are putting in the orthopedic surgeons. You're the guys who are doing it.
Yeah, and I think, for the doctors and the surgeons, I think, who rightfully have concern about managers or people telling them how to practice medicine, I think there's a whole layer of healthcare process that, lends itself much more to standardization. So let's say if a surgeon says, well, I'm not going to follow the quote-unquote universal protocol. I'm not going to do the timeout before surgery because you know what? It works for me. I've never had a wrong site surgery. I think, an organization might step back and say, well, you know what? That's non-negotiable. If you want to practice here, you need to follow that standard because it really is proven to be better for the patients, unless it's a purely emergent situation where that a delay to do the timeout would jeopardize the patient.
Right.
I think, when I've done work in primary care, we're looking at standardizing processes that support the doctors. We're not getting in the middle of their diagnosis and patient interaction. So I think, in all these things, there's probably gray area in judgment. And that's what we do as people, right?
I do wonder if in some way the very terminology standard work has created its own problem. That it sounds like you're forcing me into a cookie cutter. You're forcing me to paint by numbers. And if we called it, I know there's obviously plenty of discussion about this and there's reasons not to do it, but if you called it best practices, a lot of people would say, oh, well, there are best practices for doing an appendectomy. Yeah.
Well, but at the same time, I hear there's negative connotations to that term too.
Absolutely.
Toyota publications tend to use the phrase standardized work instead of just standard, because I think, right or wrong, I think standard sounds very definite, where to me standardized implies there's kind of a spectrum. It's more standard than it was before because there's benefits to doing that, but we don't take it to an illogical extreme. That's why I like the term standardized work, but it's just a word.
Yeah. Certainly there's no perfect solution except, of course, to spend time with people and show them and explain it to them. And then you could call it whatever you want, because then it doesn't matter once people understand what the intent is and how it should be done.
Yeah. But the other comment I'll make, and I hear your reaction, then we'll move on to his other principles from your book. I had this kind of a conversation around, people say, we can't get caught in circular logic. We need to standardize that. And I'll ask why. Because Lean says so. Why? The goal is not standardization. The goal is improving safety and quality and all these other things that matter. Standardization, when it's helpful, is a means to an end, as opposed to something to get obsessive about.
Well, that always reminds me of the conversations you and I have had about 5S, and we need we need 5S for the pencils on our desk. Well,
why?
Why? Maybe you do, but you'd have to come up with a pretty good reason why the number of pencils that you're using actually matters and where they are located.
Yeah.
And there are environments where that is important, but generally speaking, not so much.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned 5S, I guess a form of visual management, the fifth principle. Let's bring it back to your book. Talk about how visual management applies or what the parallels are from the worlds of fitness and work.
So in the fitness world, think about visual management as real-time feedback. If you go into a gym, one of the first things you see is yourself, and that's because there are mirrors everywhere. You want to have mirrors because if you're doing bench pressing or squats or whatever, you want to be able to see what you're doing to make sure you don't blow out a knee. That makes sense.
I thought it was just to admire your muscles.
Well, there is the narcissistic, there is the ability to admire your muscles, and also to check out the cute guy or girl next to you. Okay, but it's also fundamentally there to help you self-correct in the middle of an exercise. Make sure you do it right. If you think about the high-tech version of this, we've got all kinds of fitness trackers. We've got Apple Watches, we've got Fitbits and Jawbones and whatnot, Nike Fuel Bands. The idea here is that you want to find out when you're running or exercising, you want to make sure that your pulse is below your lactate threshold, say, so it's not maxed out. Or perhaps you want to find out that if you're trying to walk 10,000 steps a day, you want to find out in the middle of the day that you're only at 2,500. You don't want to find out at the end of the week or the end of the month that you missed your target because then it's too late. So we do all of these things to give us real-time feedback so that we're able to correct before the game is over, before it's too late. Now, if you look in most organizations, particularly the office side, the work is invisible. It's electrons, it's not protons, so you don't actually have something moving down an assembly line. It's usually bits and bytes being transferred between computers. And you see people sitting at their desks, and you have no idea if they're on pace or behind pace or ahead of pace. You have no idea if the work is quality or not, or defective. So the question I always have is, and I think that it's important to consider, is how can we make office work in particular, people are much, much better at this in factories, but how can we make the work we're doing visible so that we can see in real time that this is quality or not quality, that we're ahead or behind? In the book, of course, I've got all kinds of, it being a visual management chapter, I've got all kinds of pictures, and it's kind of hard to talk about the photos.
But people should go buy the book. Then
people should buy the book, absolutely. Or the ebook is even better because then the pictures are in color and they render much better than they did in the black and white book.
Okay.
But the idea is, I've been in a law firm, a patent office, a specialty law firm that does patent applications, and all of their work is visible. So they can see at any given moment where a client matter is, what the status is, whether it's ahead or behind, where it is at the patent office. And so at any given time, if a customer calls and says, hey, what's going on with my patent XYZ, anyone can pick up the phone and say, oh, well, it looks like Roger's working on this and he's got another day to do it, and then it'll be posted for review or something like that. I have seen an architecture and construction company, two of them actually, that run their projects with Post-it notes on walls, on whiteboards. And these are commercial projects, and we're not talking about building a doghouse. We're talking about office buildings. We're talking about hospitals, things like this. And they manage the very, very, very complicated flows of material and information, not just internal, of course, but from their suppliers, all through visual boards. So at any given time you can see, oh, look, the carpenters are coming. Oh, look, the guys laying the foundation are late. Oh, the steel people are on time, or there was a problem. What was the problem? They can see it.
Yeah. And
when you have that kind of information, you have the opportunity to make real-time corrections and compensate as necessary or just as necessary.
Right.
And that's what we do in the fitness world. everyone who's ever run a 5K race or a 10K race is running with a watch, and they say, "Oh, look, here I am at the mile mark, and I'm at whatever. I'm 10 seconds ahead of pace, or I'm 10 seconds behind."
Yeah.
Why don't we have that in the workplace?
Yeah. Well, and I think I would just emphasize and amplify what you said about the idea of real-time feedback. A lot of times, I think people mistake the idea of visual management for monthly performance metrics. And we posted the chart on the wall, therefore it's visual, and that's visual management. I'm like, well, I mean, we don't, from a fitness standpoint, weighing yourself every single day, you may, there's going to maybe be some fluctuation that you shouldn't overreact to. But, if you're dieting and trying to lose weight, I'm sure you want to measure yourself more than once a month. Weigh yourself once a month. You need a little bit more ongoing real-time feedback, whether it's that number or, to your example of thinking like, working with the trainer and looking in the mirror and you're doing squats, and don't let your knee go out in front of your foot.
Right.
Like,
right.
You can try to look for that, but I'm trying to think like, well, would there be a way of putting a line on the mirror that says, don't let your leg...
Right.
I guess the visual is just looking at your own reflection. But, to have some sort of guide, like, some hospitals will use visual management to have a line and an indicator to mark that if a patient's on a ventilator, the bed should not be reclined any further than this. There's a clear, real-time, there's a visual that you then, if it's being violated, have to react to. So that's the management side of it, visual and management, as opposed to just looking at the monthly data and the metrics around ventilator-associated pneumonia rates. Right. You get much better, more actionable feedback when you're looking for the real-time visual control instead of just looking at a visual metric.
Absolutely. And it makes all the difference because the metaphor that, I don't know if I was clever enough to come up with it or I swiped it from someone, but it's like if you don't have the visual feedback, it's like driving someplace by looking in the rearview mirror.
Yeah.
You can't see where you're going because you're looking at the weekend, month-end, quarter-end statistics, which tells you nothing. By the time you see it, it's too late.
Yeah, or it tells you something and the truth is hidden in that data. I mean, Dr. Deming and his contemporaries would use that analogy about driving using the rearview mirror. Or, I think of workplace situations where people have monthly metrics. There's so much variation in knowledge that gets lost. It's sort of like compressing video, to pick a totally different analogy. If you compress the video, at some point you lose a lot of the information there, and the picture's grainier than it could be.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the advantages of real-time metrics. And I would sort of try to encourage people, don't overreact to every up and down in the data. Why was productivity worse than yesterday?
Right.
Sometimes it just is. But people don't like that as an answer.
Right. And we're dealing with such enormously complicated or complex systems that you can't have, and Lord knows the red bead experiment is a perfect example of this.
Right.
There's going to be variation because systems are complex. And variation is inevitable.
Yeah.
But when you have real-time feedback, you can at least, when you do have special cause, you can start to say, here's something I can see now, and here's something I can react to. Yeah. And even better, with real-time feedback, you can prevent yourself from going over the cliff. You can prevent yourself from, if you're running a race, you can prevent yourself from running too hard in the beginning because you're getting real-time feedback. I better slow down. I've got another 12 miles to go.
Yeah.
I better be careful. Keep my knee. I'm doing a squat. I better keep my knee behind my foot, my toes. Otherwise, I'm going to blow out my knee. So having that feedback prevents you from getting into trouble.
But then I think it comes back to standardized work and the TWI mindsets. Here's why you need to keep your knee in a certain position so you don't blow out your knee. There's that reason why. That's a key point. You don't want to get hurt. It's not just the trainer being fussy for no good reason.
Right.
So maybe we talk about trainers, and maybe we can transition into the sixth principle. When you talk about coaching, I think a good trainer is a coach. When I was in marching band all through high school and college, our marching band directors were coaches. You talk about in the book the coaching triangle. What does that mean, and what's the importance of coaching in the context of lean?
Well, I try to think about great coaches, and I used to be a coach, as I said, an athletic coach. And obviously there's because the world is filled with 7 billion different people, there are 7 billion different ways of coaching. But I think that when we tell people they should be a coach, I think there are 3 things that are really worth considering to become an effective coach. And the first one is to go see. Yeah. This is straight out of the Lean playbook, of course. Go see. Genchi Genbutsu. And the theory here, of course, is that it's much easier to coach when you actually see what's happening. And if anyone has a personal trainer, they can imagine what the difference is if they just get workouts from a trainer via email or via Skype call versus the trainer meeting you in the gym or showing up at your house. It's an entirely different dynamic in terms of motivation, in terms of adherence to the protocol or the workout, in terms of excitement, in terms of learning. So go and see is really important. Participation. In my mind, the best coaches participate. So if you take a look at someone like Jim Caldwell, who used to coach the Indianapolis Colts, or Bill Belichick, and I hate mentioning Bill Belichick because he coaches the Patriots, and I'm from New York, and so I'm a New York Jet fan, and so it kills me to talk about Bill Belichick, but he actually will run the plays. He'll participate in the practices. He doesn't just show up to go see, but he actually participates. He shows players how to do stuff. And obviously he's 55 years old or whatever. He's not actually tackling a 310-pound guy, but he's showing people how it's done. And before I get to the third part,
well, I was going to say, but Jim Harbaugh, who's now coaching at the University of Michigan, I think he's probably about 50 years old, and he's still out there running around with the players.
Exactly. I don't think John Wooden, when he was coaching the UCLA Bruins, the men's basketball team, to 11 titles in 13 years, I don't think he was dunking over any of his players when he was 80 years old or 75 years old. But the participation is important because it shows one, not only how to do it, but it shows that you're involved. And Art Byrne wrote something in his book, The Lean Turnaround. He said something like, you can't just send a memo, and John Chusentis has written the same thing, essentially. You can't send a memo. You've got to do it. You've got to go to the shop floor. You've got to lead it. You've got to do it. You've got to be part of it. And while, sort of the ultimate extreme of this is Paul Akers over at FastCap in Washington. There's a fantastic video on his website, 2secondlean.com. You can go see Paul scrubbing the toilet. Now, here's the CEO of a company. I don't know exactly how big it is, but you can imagine that he has a lot of things on his plate that he's trying to do. But it's so important for him to coach and to lead and to participate so that everyone says, oh, you know what? If it's important enough for Paul to be showing us how to scrub the toilet and do it this way, I guess it really is important for our company. So that participation element is just huge. And I think that if you go see and you show and you participate, you never end up on Undercover Boss looking like a jackass.
not being so out of touch.
Right. Yeah. What? I had no idea that you were working in an unheated room in the middle of winter in Michigan. Oh, I guess that's bad. And then the last element of the triangle, I believe, is showing respect. And this is not just the obvious. Don't be a jerk to people that you're leading. That's obvious, I think, at least one would hope. But the other element is what Mike Rother, I think, has really done a great job of exploring in his book, Toyota Kata, this notion of helping people, respecting people's ability to learn, to grow, to solve problems creatively on their own, with guidance, of course. Yes. So rather than just giving them the answer, do it this way, help them think through it so they become better problem solvers on their own, respecting their ability to grow. Yeah. And that is another thing you see with all the great coaches, that they respect your ability. They don't just say, shut up and do it. They help you try to figure out what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how to do it better. Yeah. And those 3 elements, that triangle, I think, is where you start to really see great coaching and great results.
And you call it a triangle because all 3 of those pieces need to be there in sort of a mutually supportive way?
Yeah, exactly. You certainly could just go see and participate. And if you're a jerk about it, people are not going to respect you, and you're not going to get the results you want. You can be very, very respectful of people and support them, but if you never see their environment or participate in what they're doing, they're going to say, yeah, this really isn't all that important to the CEO or to the VP of operations or whatever. Mm-hmm. Because if it were important, she would be here. Mm. So I think that having all three creates a strong community bonds that lead to improved performance, that lead to continuously improved performance.
Yeah. And there's been so much talk, I think, in the past couple of years about coaching and the lean community. There's conferences. There's all sorts of different events and summit topics about this. What do you hear? What do you think are the biggest concerns or challenges people have? If they want to be a coach and they're trying to get better at it, are there any sort of common ideas or thoughts that you might share with the listeners here before we wrap up?
Boy, I'd rather have the listeners share with me. I would say honestly, this is my greatest area of weakness, Mark. It is so hard for me to shut my trap and to ask questions instead of telling people. I'm so used to being a teacher, and I love being a teacher, that I'm always leaping into the breach and saying, well, what if you try this? And what if you try that? And doing everything that I say you shouldn't do. Well, I'm not respecting people's ability to learn and grow. And this is my greatest challenge within the personal professional development. I have such difficulty with this. Yeah. Well, so if you have ideas, you should tell me.
No, I think your answer, raises that in a good way, that one of the challenges with coaching, and I think even as consultants and teachers, we face this idea that we need to sometimes just kind of shut up, or we need to ask good questions and
then shut up.
Not assume we know the answer or the path. If somebody were to just come to me and say, well, I want coaching on my coaching, I wouldn't lay out a 14-step program of lectures and interactions. I think you have to coach by observing and asking questions and giving feedback, and it's a fairly organic process. Maybe I haven't done enough of it to make a standardized process out of that.
And I think that to me is really the brilliant aspect of Mike Rother's book. Mm-hmm. He recognizes that, and this is Toyota Kata again, he recognizes that it's really, really hard for us to not help. Yeah. It's hard for us to step away. And so, yes, his 5 questions are robotic. And that's precisely the point. So that you don't have a choice. You read off the card and you ask these 5 questions the same way, in the same sequence every single day. And eventually, in 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years, you change the questions to be more representative or reflective of of who you are and your personality and the situation you're in. But he takes away, by creating here we go, the standardized work for questioning and coaching, he takes away the variation that comes from you thinking, oh boy, Roger's really struggling here. Let me just give him the answer. Or, boy, I'm kind of rushed. Let me just tell him what to do so that I can move on because I'm late for this meeting or have to see a customer or whatever it is. Yeah. And so Mike slows you down, forces you to do these steps. And in so doing, he has codified the respect for people by forcing people to shut up, ask questions, and listen to the results. Yeah. There's still plenty of opportunity for organic back and forth and discussion and questions, but this goes it goes a long way towards getting us out of the trouble of trying to help too much.
Yeah, well, good thoughts, and I think we'll go ahead and wrap up here. We've gotten 2 really good episodes out of your book, Dan. So thank you for that. I hope the listeners enjoyed it. Building the Fit organization. Do I have that right? I'm blanking out.
You do. Building the Fit organization.
Building the Fit organization. how can people find you online if they want to talk with you, get some coaching, learn more about your books and your work? Remind everyone websites and everything we can.
The website is Markovitz Consulting, and it's spelled with a V, not a W. You can email me, Dan@Markovitz Consulting. I tweet under the handle Dan Markovitz. And obviously, if you Google Building a Fit Organization or type that in, that website is a redirect URL to my home. So you can find me any one of those ways.
Okay, well, great. Well, Dan, hey, it's a pleasure talking to you. Congratulations again on the recognition of the Shingo Research Award for the book, and encourage everyone to go out and check it out. Thanks for being a guest today.
Mark, it's been a great pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Sure thing. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For Lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.